The world has been stone for as long as anyone remembers. Sharp stone, heavy stone, sometimes smooth, sometimes chipped into a tool that fits neatly in a calloused hand. For thousands of years, stone was the dependable companion of humankind. A flint blade to slice, hides an obsidian scraper to prepare meat, a polished axe to cut down trees. Familiar, simple, reliable, like the Stone Age version of duct tape. But one day, somewhere in the deep past, someone noticed a glint in a riverbed. A pebble that didn't fracture like flint, didn't splinter into jagged shards. Instead, under pressure, it bent. Maybe a curious hand picked it up, tapped it with another rock, and saw it flatten, not shatter. That soft shimmer was copper. And for the first time in human history, people realized that the world contained materials stranger and more malleable than stone. We tend to romanticize these discoveries as lightning bolts of genius, but most of them were more like happy accidents. Some shepherd, some potter, some kid poking at a fire. Who knows? Imagine a child throwing a greenish lump into the flames, only to find it dripping and glowing in the embers the next morning. Or a hunter tucking a shiny nugget into his pouch, only to notice later that it had smeared, dented, and changed shape under pressure. And in that tiny moment of curiosity, the long Stone Age began to crack open. The earliest experiments with copper didn't change the world overnight. Around 7,000 years ago, in places like the Balkans and Anatolia, people were hammering small bits of native copper into beads and pins. They weren't swords or plowshares. They were ornaments, little flashes of beauty worn on the body. Copper was too soft to chop wood or till soil. Try cutting meat with a pure copper blade, and you'll quickly discover you've invented a very bendy spoon. Stone tools still did the heavy lifting, but even soft copper had something stone never had: shine. And humans, then as now, were absolute magpies for anything that glittered. What copper represented wasn't just utility, it was possibility. It was proof that the world could be reshaped in ways no one had imagined. Stone had to be chipped, broken, persuaded to take a shape. Copper could be molded, flattened, even eventually melted and poured. That was alchemy compared to napping rocks. And you can almost hear the quiet gasp of discovery echoing across centuries like the spark before a wildfire. Of course, the first metalworkers didn't know they were metalworkers. They were tinkerers, curious hands at the hearth people trying to push the limits of fire. Fire itself was already humanity's great invention, a tamed sun on the ground. By 5000 BC, villages like Belivode in Serbia show evidence of people using kilns not just for pottery, but hot enough to smelt copper from ore. Imagine the astonishment throw in a dull green rock. Add enough heat, and suddenly liquid metal drips out like molten sunrise. It wasn't efficient, it wasn't easy, but it was mesmerizing. Early smelters would have needed temperatures above 1,000 degrees Celsius, no small feat without modern blowtorches. They built clay furnaces, fed them wood, and pumped the flames with leather bellows. And from the ashes came this miraculous substance, glowing and alive, waiting to be shaped. It must have felt like summoning something divine. And here's the thing, copper wasn't just new, it was exclusive. Not every village had the right ores nearby. Not every community had the knowledge to smelt. That meant those who did suddenly had power. A bead of copper wasn't just an accessory. It was a status symbol, a mark that said, "I know secrets you don't." From the start, metal carried with it the seeds of hierarchy. But for all its promise, copper had problems. A copper axe couldn't fell a tree without bending. A copper knife dulled almost instantly. It was as if the universe had given humanity the key to a treasure chest, but the key kept snapping in the lock. So for centuries, People lived in an in-between world, still stone, but sprinkled with copper ornaments that hinted at something more. Archaeologists even have a term for it, the Chalcolithic, or Copperstone Age. And yet beneath the surface, the revolution was brewing. Because copper wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of the experiment. When smelters threw different ores into the fire, sometimes impurities came along for the ride. A dusting of tin, a trace of arsenic. Suddenly, the weak, bendy copper hardened into something tougher, sharper, more resilient. This was the birth of bronze, but we're not there yet. For now, picture a world of transition. The village of Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, around 7,000 years ago. Mud brick houses clustered like a honeycomb. Obsidian blades, still the prized cutting edge, but a few copper trinkets appearing in the graves of the wealthy. The old world of stone still dominated, but the seeds of change had been planted. And in those workshops, in the smoky glow of furnaces, a new class of specialists was being born. Unlike stone knapping, which almost anyone could learn with practiced metallurgy, required skill, patience, and secrecy. You had to know which ores to collect, how to crush them, how to build furnaces that wouldn't crack under heat, how to pump air steadily into a fire until it roared white hot, and then how to pour glowing liquid into molds without burning your hands off. These weren't weekend hobbies. They were crafts that demanded years to master. Slowly, the first guild of specialists, the metal workers, emerged. And let's be honest, to their neighbors, they must have looked like wizards. Imagine the awe of watching someone pull liquid fire from a furnace and then shape it into a gleaming tool. These early smiths had both practical and mystical power. In many cultures, they became half craftsmen, half priest, guardians of the knowledge of fire and ore. But there was something else happening too, something quieter, but just as transformative. Metal wasn't only changing tools, it was changing society itself. In cemeteries like Varna, in Bulgaria, dating to around 4500 BC, archaeologists found burials rich with gold and copper objects. One man's grave contained over a kilo of gold, the earliest worked gold known on Earth, along with copper axes and weapons. Meanwhile, others nearby were buried with almost nothing. Metal had become the currency of inequality, a new way to mark who was powerful and who was not. The Stone Age had been long, steady, communal. But with the first sparks of metallurgy, the seeds of hierarchy, trade, and ambition were planted. Metal didn't just shine, it divided. And as societies discovered how to bend the Earth's hidden treasures to their will, they were also bending the course of history. So here we are, at the threshold, copper beads glinting in the sun, experimental furnaces, glowing metalworkers whispering their secrets. The Stone Age isn't gone yet, but its days are numbered, because somewhere, in a smoky Anatolian workshop, a furnace is burning hot, an ore is melting, and the first true bronze is about to be born. And that's when the fireworks really begin. Picture the scene, a small, smoky workshop in the mountains of Anatolia around 3300 BC. The air is thick with charcoal dust. Clay furnaces roar as bellows wheeze, pushing flames hotter and hotter until they glow white against the night. Copper ore goes in. Usually it dribbles out as that familiar reddish metal, soft and promising. But on this particular day, the results look different. Instead of pliable, bendy copper, the cooled lump is harder. It rings with a sharper clink when struck. It holds an edge, better resists bending. This was no ordinary copper. This was an alloy. And though no one at the time could have explained it in chemical terms, someone had just stumbled into history's first supermaterial bronze. Now, to be fair, no ancient smelter sat back, stroked their beard, and declared, "Ah yes, the perfect 88-12 ratio of copper to tin. It probably happened by accident. Copper ores in some regions contained impurities, traces of tin or arsenic that snuck into the melt. The smiths noticed something miraculous. Their once fragile tools now held sharp edges longer. Their ornaments shone with a new golden sheen. Their axes bit into wood without folding. And if you're wondering how long it took for them to realize this was worth repeating, the answer is not long. Imagine the gossip spreading down trade routes. There's a village upriver whose axes don't break. Where did they get that copper? Soon smiths weren't just happy with natural impurities, they started hunting for them. Somewhere along the way, someone deliberately added tin to the smelting process. And just like that, the age of bronze truly began. Bronze wasn't just a little better than copper, it was a leap. Pure copper bends like soft clay under pressure. Bronze with about 10 to 12% tin is 2 to 3 times harder. It holds a keen edge, it resists wear, and crucially, it can be cast into complex shapes. Stone could be chipped, copper could be hammered, bronze could be poured. That meant not just better tools, but new kinds of tools, weapons and ornaments that had never existed before. Think about what that meant for warfare alone. A stone axe can split wood. A bronze axe can split armor and keep splitting all day. A stone dagger might pierce flesh once or twice before its edge blunts. A bronze sword could gleam in battle after battle, reliable and deadly. Suddenly, having bronze meant surviving, or not. Entire communities who lacked it became vulnerable to those who wielded it. And bronze wasn't just practical, it was beautiful. When polished, it gleamed with a warm golden shine, less gaudy than pure gold, but far more useful. You could wear it around your neck as jewelry in the morning, then swing it into a tree in the afternoon, and it would serve both roles admirably. Humans being humans adored that combination of glamour and function. But here's the twist. Bronze wasn't easy. Unlike copper, which can sometimes be found as native nuggets, tin is rarer. Far rarer. You couldn't just trip over it in a stream bed. Instead, you had to know where to look, often hundreds of miles away. And so began one of history's first global hunts, the search for tin. Picture caravans inching across Anatolian mountain passes, ships hugging the coast of Cyprus, traders trudging from Central Asia to the shores of Britain, all to chase a metal that most people in the world had never even heard of. Tin became the oil of the ancient world, the rare additive that made everything else work. Control tin, and you controlled power. Archaeologists know this from the strange shapes of ancient ingots. Some were cast into oxide forms, slabs with handles resembling stretched animal hides that could be carried by hand or loaded onto ships. These ingots have been found scattered across the Mediterranean, stamped with markings to show their origin and quality. It's as if Bronze Age merchants invented branding and quality control long before Amazon and FedEx. And so, the discovery of bronze reshaped society in ways no one could have predicted. Smiths became more important than ever. Their secrets guarded their skills, demanded by kings and chiefs. Warriors carrying bronze weapons rose above ordinary farmers. Elites demanded ornaments of the new alloy to flaunt in life and take with them in death. The first true international trade networks were born, all to feed the hunger for this miraculous mixture of copper and tin. But let's not forget the ordinary people in all this. Imagine being a farmer, tilling the earth with a wooden plow or a chipped flint hoe. Then suddenly, someone hands you a bronze-tipped plowshare. It cuts deeper, lasts longer, opens stubborn soils that you could never touch before. Your harvest grows. Your village thrives. You start to have a surplus, which means you can trade, you can specialize, you can build. That's the quiet revolution of bronze, Not just sharper swords, but fuller granaries. Of course, every gift has its cost. Smelting bronze devoured forests, burning wood to charcoal to keep those furnaces hot. A single axe might require hundreds of kilos of wood to produce. Around smelting centers, pollen records show forests, thinning fields, eroding. To make the Bronze Age shine, whole landscapes were sacrificed. Progress, it turns out, has always come with an environmental bill. Still, in those first centuries, the benefits seemed worth it. From Anatolia to Mesopotamia, from the Nile to the Indus, gleaming new tools and weapons reshaped human destiny. Bronze was not just stronger than copper, it was civilization made metal. And so, quite by accident, a strange alchemy had been discovered, a partnership between copper and tin, between fire and earth, between curiosity and persistence. It began with a smelter noticing something different in the furnace, and ended with entire societies reforged. The Stone Age world was fading fast. The Bronze Age world was rising brighter, sharper, and far more dangerous. If you were alive 5,000 years ago and happened to stroll past a Bronze Age workshop, you might have thought you'd wandered into a place of magic. The air would be hot and metallic, the glow of the furnace painting everyone in flickering orange. Sparks would spit like fireflies as hammers rang against anvils. And there, in the smoky half-dark men, and perhaps women too, though history is quieter about them, bent over crucibles and molds, coaxing liquid fire into useful form. This was no ordinary labor. Most people in that world were farmers, potters, herders, jobs you could learn by watching your neighbors. But metallurgy, that was different. It demanded years of training, steady hands, and an almost priestly control of flame. Too little heat in the ore just sat there stubborn rock. Too much, and the furnace cracked or the metal boiled away into waste. Smelting was an art balanced on the edge of catastrophe. That difficulty gave metal workers a special aura. In places like Çatalhöyük and later Arslantepe, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of entire neighborhoods devoted to this new craft. Furnaces, crucibles discarded slag half-finished tools, all signs that some people weren't spending their lives sowing barley or tending goats. They were specialists. They devoted themselves entirely to the mystery of turning earth into treasure. And society noticed. To wield bronze was to wield power, but to make bronze was to create it from nothing. Imagine being a villager, watching a smith pour molten metal into a mold, the glowing stream hissing and spitting as it filled the cavity. When the clay shell was broken apart, what emerged was not a rock, not a shard of flint, but something utterly alien, a gleaming axe head or dagger smooth and sharp, as if conjured by divine hands. You might forgive your ancestors for thinking these smiths had one foot in the mortal world and the other in the realm of gods. Indeed, in many early cultures, smiths became semi-sacred. They weren't just craftsmen, they were sorcerers of the furnace keepers of knowledge, as dangerous as it was precious. In later African traditions, blacksmiths were often thought to possess mystical powers, and in Eurasia, they sometimes doubled as ritual leaders. It's easy to imagine that such beliefs began here in the dawn of metallurgy, when controlling fire and metal seemed like nothing short of a miracle. Of course, prestige comes with perks. Archaeological digs tell us that metalworkers often lived in larger homes with better food and goods than ordinary folk. In Mesopotamia, palace tablets list bronze smiths right alongside priests and administrators receiving rations as if they were officials of state. By the time Linear B tablets were being written in Mycenaean Greece, smiths were on the payroll of kings, their work controlled and counted as carefully as grain. And yet these craftsmen weren't just serving elites. They were changing daily life for everyone. A bronze sickle shaped with a neat curve and serrated edge could harvest more grain in an hour than a flint blade might in a day. Bronze axes cut timber for new homes. Bronze fishhooks pulled more from the rivers. The smith's handiwork flowed outward into the community, easing labor, reshaping economies. But this dependence had a shadow. Unlike stone tools, which anyone could chip together with a bit of practice, bronze required access to ore's furnaces, and above all, the smith's know-how. Communities that once prided themselves on self-reliance suddenly leaned on a narrow class of specialists. Lose your smith, and you lost the ability to fight farm or trade effectively. It was as if the village's very survival hinged on the man tending the fire. This gave smiths leverage. They weren't rulers, at least not usually, but they could demand respect, protection, and resources. If you're picturing the stereotypical cranky blacksmith from a fantasy novel, sweaty, soot-stained, but indispensable, you're not far off. They probably carried themselves with that same gruff authority. After all, if you wanted your plowshare mended, your spear recast, or your ornaments gleaming, you had to keep the smith happy. And because metal was scarce and precious, many smiths also became gatekeepers of inequality. They decided who got the best blades, who received a finely cast axe versus a rough second-rate one. In a world where weapons meant survival, that was no small power. Archaeologists at sites like Varna have found burials filled with bronze goods, ornaments, weapons, tools, while other graves in the same cemetery hold almost nothing. The difference wasn't just luck. It was the reflection of a society where access to metal had become the currency of status. We might be tempted to imagine the Bronze Age smith as a lonely genius hammering away in his workshop, but in reality, metallurgy was rarely a solo act. Excavations at Arslan Tepe show entire production complexes, furnaces with slag heaps, molds stacked in corners, teams of laborers hauling or chopping wood for charcoal pumping bellows for hours on end. The master smith may have held the secrets, but it took many hands to keep the fire burning. Bronze wasn't just a craft, it was an industry. And industries reshaped the world. More ore meant more mines, dug deeper into hillsides, chiseling at veins of copper. More fuel meant more trees cut down forests, shrinking around smelting centers. More bronze meant more trade caravans carrying ingots and tools across mountains, ships laden with metal slipping along coastlines. Behind the glow of the smith's forge lay a vast machine of extraction labor and exchange. It's humbling to realize the rise of the metalworker was the rise of specialization itself. Here were people no longer generalists, no longer farmers by day, and tool makers by necessity, but professionals defined by their craft. And that shift from a world where most could do everything to a world where some did one thing very well is the foundation of every complex society that followed. So when you picture the Bronze Age, don't just imagine warriors in shining helmets or kings weighed down with golden ornaments. Imagine the smith hair, matted with sweat face, glowing in the furnace's light hammer ringing against metal. He wasn't just making tools. He was making a new world, one shaped by fire alloy and the rising prestige of those who could bend the earth's hidden metals to human will. And in that glow, civilization itself was being reforged. If the early metalworkers seemed like wizards, the graves of their patrons looked like treasure chests ripped from the pages of myth. Imagine the windswept Black Sea coast of Bulgaria around 4500 BC. There lies Varna, one of the most astonishing archaeological sites ever uncovered. When the necropolis was excavated in the 1970s, what emerged wasn't just a cemetery, it was a revelation. Over 300 graves, some modest, some overflowing, painted a picture of a society already reshaped by metal. In one grave, archaeologists call it Grave 43, lay the body of a man, middle-aged, perhaps a local chieftain or leader. Beside him glimmered more than 1.5 kilos of gold diadems, beads, ornaments, jewelry. And nestled among the treasures were copper axes, chisels, and a stone hammer axe. It was the kind of burial that shouted power, privilege, and prestige louder than any proclamation carved in stone. If you've ever heard the phrase, "The one who dies with the most toys wins well," this man was well on his way. What makes Varna so striking isn't just the abundance of treasure, but the contrast. In some graves, the dead were surrounded by shining ornaments, weapons, and imported luxuries. In others, there was nothing, just the body and silence. Side by side, these burials show us something that had been almost invisible in earlier Neolithic societies: inequality. During the long millennia of the Stone Age, most burials were fairly similar. A pot here, a bead there. Differences existed, but they were subtle. At Varna, suddenly the gap yawns wide. Some people were buried like kings, others like peasants. And what's the dividing line? Access to metal. The copper axe wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of authority. The gold ornament wasn't just decoration, it was proof of belonging to the upper stratum of society. We often talk about the birth of civilization in terms of cities, writing, or agriculture. But Varna whispers another possibility. Maybe civilization begins with inequality. The moment when some graves glimmer with gold while others sink into the earth, empty, society has changed. Power is no longer just about who can grow food or swing a club. It's about who controls the resources, who holds the knowledge, who owns the sparkle of metal. And there's something almost theatrical about it. The necropolis is a stage, and each burial a performance. The elite man in Grave 43 wasn't just being buried, he was being displayed. His copper tools proclaimed him a leader. His gold ornaments a person of divine favor. Even in death, he was making a statement. Remember me as more than a man. Remember me as one above others. It's tempting to imagine the funeral. The whole community gathered. The smiths, who made his gleaming tools, standing at the edge of the crowd. Farmers, children, elders, all watching as his body was lowered into the earth, surrounded by treasures most of them would never even touch. Perhaps incense smoldered. Perhaps chants rose, and then the grave was sealed, the earth covering the glitter, leaving only memory and inequality behind. But Varna isn't just about inequality, it's also about connection. Many of the goods in the necropolis came from far away. Seashells from the Mediterranean, obsidian blades, exotic stones. These graves tell us that even at this early stage, networks of trade stretched across Europe and beyond. To control metal was to control not only your village, but also the links that tied you to distant lands. And this is where metal really starts to reshape human imagination. A flint axe can be sharp, but it doesn't sparkle. A stone bead can be pretty, but it doesn't gleam like the sun. Metal brought with it a kind of otherworldly quality. Its shine seemed eternal, untarnished by time. Is it any wonder that gold and copper quickly became associated with gods, with kingship, with immortality? In some ways, the Varna burials are less about the dead and more about what the living wanted to believe, that metal could confer power that reached beyond life itself. It's worth pausing to reflect here. We live in a world of mass production, where jewelry can be bought in bulk and tools churned out by machines. But in Varna, every piece of gold, every copper axe represented hours, days of labor. Ore had to be mined, carried, smelted, hammered. Gold had to be panned from rivers, melted, cast. To bury such wealth was to remove it from circulation forever. That was extravagance on a scale that would have astonished any Stone Age villager. It was proof of surplus proof, of hierarchy proof, that someone had enough power to demand not just labor in life, but sacrifice in death. The Varna necropolis is often called the world's first evidence of social stratification, and it's hard to argue. Those glittering graves mark the moment when metal and society fused into something new hierarchy. The smiths may have held the secrets of fire, but the elites held the smiths. And together, they created a social order that would echo for millennia rulers, crowned in gold soldiers, armed in bronze peasants, working with tools whose design they had no say in. And yet, standing in that ancient cemetery, it's not hard to feel awe. Gold ornaments still gleam after 6,000 years untarnished. The copper axes still carry their edges. The earth has shifted. The people are long gone, but their message endures. We were powerful, and we wanted you to know it. So the Stone Age world was gone, replaced by one of glitter and hierarchy. With each grave dug, the foundations of kingship and class were laid. And beyond the cemetery walls, the first true cities were beginning to rise, built on bronze tools, bronze weapons, and the unequal glitter of gold. The graves of Varna whispered of hierarchy, but to see how bronze truly reshaped the world, we have to walk further east into the river valleys of Mesopotamia, where entire cities were sprouting like reeds along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. This was the real leap from villages with a few hundred people to sprawling urban centers housing tens of thousands. And bronze was there at every step, woven into the very bricks of these first civilizations. Close your eyes and picture Uruk around 3200 BC. The air is hot, the dust sticks to your skin, and in the distance, whitewashed temples rise above a maze of mud brick houses. The smell of baking bread mingles with the acrid tang of molten copper drifting from workshops. Donkeys bray at the city gate, pulling carts piled with grain or timber, and somewhere in the bustle, a scribe scratches wedge-shaped marks into a wet clay tablet, keeping track of rations barley for workers, copper for smiths. This was the birth of bureaucracy. Cities needed order. You can't just let 40,000 people live elbow to elbow without someone figuring out who gets what. Bronze was both symbol and substance in this new system. It equipped the workers who built walls and temples. It armed the guards who kept order, and it adorned the priests who claimed to manage not just earthly affairs, but the will of the gods. Bronze also reshaped the skyline. Think of the temple complexes, the White Temple at Uruk, perched atop an artificial platform 13 meters high. Hundreds of laborers, maybe thousands, hauled mud bricks to build it. Their tools, stone no longer bronze chisels, and picks cut cleaner, lasted longer. The precision blocks fitted together with a smoothness that earlier builders could only dream of. It was engineering fueled by metal. But bronze wasn't just about tools. It was about power, stored and tracked on clay. The earliest written records we have are receipts, ration lists, allocations of goods. And what do they mention alongside grain and wool metal? Ingots and tools. The scribes weren't writing poetry yet. They were recording who got the bronze. Civilization, in its infancy, was already obsessed with supply chains. That obsession made sense. Bronze was expensive, difficult, precious. Not everyone could make it. Not everyone could own it. Controlling bronze meant controlling people. Palaces and temples quickly learned that if you could monopolize access to ore, to workshops, to smiths, you could keep the levers of society firmly in your hands. The tool that tilled fields and the weapon that guarded walls both came from the same fiery source. Whoever held the furnace held the city. Of course, cities didn't rise on bronze alone. Agriculture was the foundation, irrigation channels fanning out like veins from the rivers, bringing life to dry soil. But bronze tools made irrigation faster, more reliable, less backbreaking. Bronze sickles cut the harvest more efficiently. Bronze hoes turned stubborn earth into farmland. And with that surplus came specialists, scribes, priests, soldiers, merchants, and yes, the smiths hammering away in their workshops. It's easy to overlook how radical this was. For tens of thousands of years, human life had been small-scale bands, tribes, villages. Now for the first time, people were living in places where they might not even know all their neighbors. The city was a machine, and bronze was one of the gears that made it run. And with cities came armies. Mesopotamia was never exactly a peaceful neighborhood. Walled city-states jostled for power, raided one another's fields, and eyed each other's canals with suspicion. Bronze gave teeth to those ambitions. Spearheads, daggers, axes sharper, deadlier, and far more uniform than stone. Soldiers could be equipped with standardized weapons, allowing for coordinated tactics. No longer was combat just farmer versus farmer, with whatever tools lay at hand. This was war, crafted cast, and sharpened in the forge. Archaeologists see the evidence in layers of fortifications, thicker walls, reinforced gates, towers sprouting from city perimeters. Communities were investing not just in temples, but in defense. Bronze had made warfare too deadly to ignore. If you didn't arm up, you were asking to be conquered. But let's not imagine Mesopotamian cities as grim fortresses only. They were alive with trade festivals, markets, picture bazaars, where merchants hawked textiles, dyed in brilliant colors, pottery glazed with shining slips and always metal ornaments, bronze pins, jewelry, and tools. Bronze was not just military hardware. It was also adornment, a way of bringing prestige into daily life. To wear a bronze bracelet was to announce subtly that you had connections, wealth, or perhaps favor from the gods. And yes, the gods. Bronze gleamed in their service too. Ritual vessels, figurines, fittings for temple doors, all cast to honor the divine. To the people of Uruk or Ur-bronze was more than a material. It was a bridge between the human and the eternal, its durability, a promise that offerings would outlast generations. The story of bronze in the first cities is in many ways the story of humanity's first true experiments with scale. Scale in agriculture, scale in population, scale in administration, scale in inequality. Stone could support a village. Bronze could support a city. And cities once born rarely went quietly back into the countryside. Still, we shouldn't get carried away. Bronze didn't transform every life equally. In the alleyways of Mesopotamia, plenty of households still scraped by with stone and clay, their lives barely touched by the glittering alloy. The elite may have lived in houses fitted with bronze door hinges and ornate vessels, but most people carried on in mud brick dwellings with pottery bowls. Civilization, from the start, was unequal. But in those bustling cities along the rivers, you can hear the heartbeat of something new. Humanity's first urban civilization, pulsing to the rhythm of bronze. The furnaces glowed, the scribes counted, the priests prayed, and the kings armed their men. And above them, all the white temples gleamed in the sun, built on the shoulders of farmers, craftsmen, and smiths alike. The Stone Age was over. The city had been born. And bronze, bright and unyielding, was its chosen metal. If bronze was humanity's first super material, then tin was its kryptonite. Copper, at least, could be found in many places across Anatolia, the Caucasus, the Alps, and the deserts of Sinai. But tin was rare, frustratingly rare. Without it, there was no bronze, just soft, bendy copper, which meant entire civilizations suddenly found themselves dependent on a metal that might be mined hundreds, even thousands of miles away. And so the Bronze Age became the first age of globalization. Imagine it caravans creaking across mountains in Central Asia, laden with sacks of ore. Ships hugging the Mediterranean coasts, their hulls packed with oxide-shaped ingots, copper, and tin slabs molded with handles so they could be carried like giant suitcases. Traders bargaining in bustling ports of Cyprus, Crete, and the Levant, their goods stamped with marks of purity and origin. Each ingot was more than metal. It was trust, a promise, a contract. The demand for bronze linked communities that might never have otherwise spoken to each other. A farmer in Mesopotamia might harvest his fields with a bronze sickle whose tin came from Cornwall, nearly 3,000 miles away. A warrior in Anatolia might swing a sword whose copper began in the mines of Cyprus, but whose edge owed its bite to tin from the highlands of Afghanistan. Entire worlds were stitched together by this glittering alloy. What's astonishing is the scale of it. Archaeologists have found identical ingots from Sardinia to Syria, some weighing 20-30 kilos, all standardized for transport. Like UPS packages of antiquity, they moved from hand to hand across sea and sand through languages and borders. And with them moved stories, gods, technologies, and diseases too. The Bronze Age wasn't just a time of metallurgy. It was the birth of the interconnected world. Of course, tin didn't travel on its own. Traders carried luxuries alongside it. Amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar wood from Lebanon. The shipwreck at Uluburun, discovered off the coast of modern Turkey and dated to around 1300 BC, is a frozen time capsule of these exchanges. On board were copper ingots from Cyprus, tin from Central Asia, Canaanite jars filled with resins, ostrich eggshells, Baltic amber, Nubian ivory. 7 cultures, all represented in one sunken cargo. If you want proof of globalization, there it is resting at the bottom of the sea. And just as today, whoever controlled the trade controlled the wealth. Ports flourished. Caravans became lifelines. Kingdoms rose by sitting astride trade routes. Imagine the toll collectors, the palace bureaucrats tallying shipments, the merchants calculating profits. Bronze turned geography into destiny. If your land held tin, you were rich. If your land didn't, you had to trade or conquer. But let's not picture this as a polite exchange of gifts across borders. Trade was risky. A caravan was as likely to meet bandits as fellow merchants. A ship might sink in a storm, taking its precious cargo to the seabed. And when supply lines broke, entire civilizations trembled. Without tin, the furnaces went quiet, the smiths sat idle, and armies lost their edge. The great power of bronze was also its great vulnerability. At the human level, though, the networks brought connection. Think of the merchant leaving his home in Mesopotamia, trudging across dusty roads, carrying a pouch of silver to exchange for tin. Think of the sailors pulling their oars in rhythm eyes, fixed on a distant coastline, bellies full of salted fish mines, on the promise of bronze waiting at journey's end. For them, trade wasn't just commerce, it was adventure, risk, and survival. And what did all this mean for the ordinary villager? It meant that somewhere in their household, whether a tool or an ornament was a piece of the world beyond. That bronze bracelet on a woman's arm, its tin might have come from faraway Cornwall. That axe in the farmer's hand, its edge might carry whispers of Afghan mountains. In a way, every bronze object was a world traveler, a silent witness to journeys across continents. The irony is that while bronze linked worlds, it also sharpened rivalries. Control of mines and trade routes became causes for war. Cities rose as trade hubs, then fell when routes shifted. Elites used bronze goods to flaunt status, while ordinary people might scrape by with stone. The very networks that connected also divided, sowing both wealth and conflict. So the Bronze Age was more than furnaces and swords. It was a world on the move, stitched together by the hunt for a rare metal that could turn soft copper into civilization's sharpest edge. And as caravans trudged and ships sailed, the human story expanded, no longer confined to valleys or villages, but stretching across seas and deserts. Bronze had taught humanity a lesson we've never unlearned, that the things we desire most often come from far away, and to get them, we must weave ourselves into a web of trade, trust, and risk. In chasing bronze, our ancestors created the first global economy, and from that web, for better and worse, civilization would never again be small. If trade was the bloodstream of the Bronze Age, then warfare was its clenched fist. For all the beauty of bronze jewelry and the practicality of bronze sickles, the alloy's most dramatic stage was the battlefield. Once you've given humans a sharper edge, it's only a matter of time before someone points it at their neighbor. Picture the first time two armies met where both carried bronze weapons. Before, in the Stone Age, fighting had been messy clubs, stones hastily sharpened flint knives. Effective, yes, but inconsistent. Now entire ranks of men bore identical bronze-tipped spears. Their edges glinted in the sun uniform, and deadly. This wasn't a scuffle. This was organized war. The transformation began quietly. Around 3000 BC, we start seeing bronze spearheads in Mesopotamia, sleek, triangular, socketed, so they could be attached firmly to wooden shafts. Compared to stone, they were devastating. A flint point could shatter on impact. A bronze point pierced and kept piercing. Suddenly, shields were needed. Suddenly, walls had to grow higher. Bronze was rewriting the rules of violence. And then came the daggers, then the swords. At first, swords were little more than elongated daggers, perhaps 30 centimeters long. But as smiths grew bolder, blades stretched, balance, improved hilts were cast as one with the blade. By 2500 BC in Anatolia, and the Aegean true swords gleamed in the hands of warriors. A weapon not just for stabbing, but for slashing, sweeping, dominating. Whoever held one wasn't just fighting with better steel. They were fighting with psychological advantage. Armor followed. Helmets hammered from bronze sheets appear in royal tombs, shaped to deflect blows. The helmet of a Sumerian warrior, buried around 2600 BC, cone-shaped and ridged, could glance off strikes that would have crushed an unprotected skull. Scale armor, hundreds of tiny bronze plates, sewn onto leather, turned fighters into gleaming walls of metal. Imagine facing such a line in battle, not ragtag villagers with stone clubs, but a phalanx of armored men, their bronze scales clinking like dragon hides in the sun. The rise of bronze weaponry also gave rise to something new: professional soldiers. In a world of stone, anyone could pick up a club or spear. In a world of bronze, weapons were expensive, crafted in specialized workshops, distributed through elites or kings. That meant the men who wielded them weren't just farmers pressed into service. They were warriors trained and supported, armed at society's expense. With bronze, the warrior class was born. And with warriors came hierarchy. Burial evidence tells the story. At Arslan Tepe in Anatolia, around 2900 BC, a warrior was laid to rest with a full set of bronze weapons: spear, sword, dagger, mace. The value of that kit equaled years of agricultural labor. Compare that to ordinary graves nearby furnished with nothing more than pottery. The message was clear: in this new world, military power was prestige. Bronze didn't just change personal combat, it transformed strategy. Standardized weapons meant armies could drill march and fight in coordinated formations. Imagine rows of bronze spear tips advancing in unison, shields, locked, each man confident his neighbor's weapon was as sharp and reliable as his own. Warfare became choreography, not chaos. Cities responded by building thicker walls, deeper moats, stronger gates. The arms race had begun. And let's not forget the chariot, that Formula One racer, of the Bronze Age battlefield. Though the Hittites and Egyptians would later perfect it, the roots go back here, lightweight two-wheeled platforms carrying archers armed with bronze-tipped arrows. A stone arrowhead might splinter on armor, a bronze one bit deep-piercing shield, and flesh alike. Mounted on chariots, they rained down death while outrunning slower infantry. Bronze had given not only sharper swords, but also the engines of ancient shock and awe. Of course, the production of all these weapons was itself a feat of organization. Bronze wasn't lying around waiting to be picked up. It had to be mined, smelted, alloyed, cast. Armies were supplied not just with spears and swords, but with spare parts, rivets, fittings. That meant workshops worked like proto-factories, turning out standardized batches. If you squint, you can almost see the shadow of the industrial age glimmering in those ancient forges. The cost, though, was staggering. Equipping even a few hundred men with bronze weapons consumed enormous amounts of metal. That meant enormous amounts of copper and tin. That meant vast networks of trade extraction and labor. War wasn't just fought on the battlefield. It was fought in the mines, in the forests, felled for charcoal in the caravans that hauled ingots across deserts. The Bronze Age army was the tip of a very large, very expensive iceberg. And yet societies paid it gladly. Because the alternative, being the village without bronze when the neighbor came knocking, was unthinkable. Communities that lacked bronze didn't just lose wars. They disappeared from the map. The alloy spread, not just because it was better, but because it was survival. There's a strange irony here. Bronze gave humanity new possibilities. Plows, sickles, tools to build cities. But it also gave humanity sharper ways to harm itself. Civilization was rising. Yes, but rising on a blade's edge. And as armies clashed, as chariots thundered across plains, as walls crumbled beneath bronze-tipped rams, one thing became clear. The Bronze Age was not just an age of progress. It was an age of conquest. For all the glitter of jewelry and the clang of weapons, the real quiet revolution of bronze took place in the fields. Armies might win battles, but harvests fed cities. Without food surpluses, there would be no temples, no palaces, no bustling markets of Mesopotamia or Egypt. And here, too, bronze reshaped the story. Imagine the labor of farming before metal wooden plows, tipped with stone, barely scratching the surface of hard-packed soil. Flint sickles their edges sharp, but fragile, needing constant repair. Farming was backbreaking work, and the limits of stone tools meant the limits of production. Land that was too dense or rocky simply couldn't be cultivated. Then along came bronze. A plowshare cast in bronze sliced deeper, bit harder, and lasted longer. In Susa, archaeologists have uncovered bronze plow parts dating to around 2700 BC, 28 centimeters long, with a cleanly shaped edge that could cut into soil like a hot knife through butter. Suddenly, land that had been stubborn was open to crops. Entire new fields bloomed because bronze could dig where stone could not. Harvest was transformed too. Bronze sickles had curved blades, often with serrated edges, designed to shear grain stalks cleanly without crushing them. One sickle from Tepe Hisar in Iran shows the blade angled just so, about 35 degrees, perfectly calculated for efficiency and for sparing the wrists of the harvester. That's not just a tool. That's ergonomic design 3,000 years before anyone coined the term. And maintenance bronze had another advantage: repair. Stone, once it chipped, was gone. Bronze could be resharpened, reforged again. Tools lasted longer. Farmers spent less time replacing them, more time working the land. That meant bigger yields, bigger surpluses. And with surpluses came cities. This wasn't just about food, it was about social transformation. When bronze plows let farmers grow more than they could eat, surpluses flowed to temples, palaces, and storehouses. Surpluses fed armies, builders, scribes, and metalworkers themselves. In a very real sense, the gleaming temples of Uruk and the pyramids of Egypt stood on bronze plowshares. Even irrigation benefited. Bronze hoes, adzes, and mattocks made digging canals easier, clearing stubborn ground, maintaining levees, cutting new channels. Tasks once grueling with stone now became possible at scale. Whole regions could be watered and farmed, systematically supporting populations in the tens of thousands. Without bronze, Mesopotamia's irrigation web might have remained a trickle. But let's not imagine this as purely utilitarian. There was pride in these tools, artistry even. Some bronze sickles and hoes were cast with ornamentation, or with careful shaping that spoke of the smith's skill. In a world where a tool might mean the difference between famine and plenty, it wasn't just equipment, it was livelihood, survival, and sometimes even status. To own good bronze tools was to be a farmer with prospects, and there were ripple effects. With more efficient farming, fewer hands were needed in the fields. That freed people to specialize: craftsmen, traders, soldiers, priests. Agriculture and metallurgy became a feedback loop. Bronze tools made surpluses. Surpluses fed specialists. Specialists made more bronze, which made more surpluses. Civilization was, in essence, a self-feeding furnace. Of course, the environment paid the price. Smelting bronze required staggering amounts of charcoal, which meant staggering amounts of wood. To make a single bronze axe head could consume the equivalent of several trees. As smelting centers churned out tools, forests shrank, soils eroded, and landscapes changed. It's no coincidence that pollen records near ancient smelting sites show sudden drops in tree cover replaced by grasses and scrub. Civilization's growth was fueled not only by bronze, but by entire forests going up in smoke. Yet for the people of the time, the benefits outweighed the costs. Picture a farmer guiding an ox-drawn plow, tipped with bronze, across a freshly opened field. Behind him, neat furrows stretch where before only weeds grew. In his hand, a bronze hoe, sharp and sturdy for breaking clods. At harvest, his family wields bronze sickles that cut swiftly through grain. That family eats better, trades more, and lives more securely than their ancestors ever did. In this sense, the real revolution of bronze wasn't on the battlefield or in the glittering tombs. It was in the quiet rhythm of plowing, sowing, and reaping. Civilization rests not just on soldiers and kings, but on farmers with better tools. And in the Bronze Age, those tools gleamed golden in the sun. For all its usefulness in war and farming, bronze had another role, one less practical, but perhaps even more powerful. Bronze was divine. To ancient eyes, it wasn't just a material. It was a substance touched by the gods themselves. And once temples discovered what molten metal could do, the sacred world began to shimmer. Step into a Bronze Age temple. Imagine the heavy scent of incense, the flicker of oil lamps on polished walls. And there, gleaming in the half-light, stands a statue not of clay, not of wood, but cast in shining bronze. Its surface glows warm gold under firelight eyes, inlaid with shell or lapis, staring back with an almost unnerving, lifelike intensity. To worshippers, this wasn't just an image. It was presence. A god here on earth captured in a metal that seemed immortal. Think about it. Stone crumbles, wood rots, clay shatters, bronze endures. What better material for the eternal temples in Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and beyond, filled with ritual vessels, figurines and fittings hammered or cast from bronze, cauldrons for offerings, libation bowls for pouring sacred liquids, door bands embossed with mythological scenes combining utility and artistry. Even the temple itself was bound with bronze, its very hinges and locks gleaming with divine authority. And bronze wasn't just durable, it was dazzling. Its sheen echoed the sun's light. Its ringing tone, when struck, seemed otherworldly. When cast into bells or lures, those great curling Nordic horns, it could literally sing. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, bronze instruments rang in rituals, their metallic resonance believed to carry prayers upward to heaven. In many cultures, smiths themselves became part priest. To cast bronze was to imitate the gods, shaping chaos ore and fire into order, a vessel, a weapon, a sacred idol. Some myths even remember this. The Greeks would later tell of Hephaestus at his forge hammering thunderbolts for Zeus. But those stories had roots here in the Bronze Age imagination, when every temple fire mirrored the smith's fire. Consider the famous snake goddess figurines from Minoan Crete. Women in elaborate dress arms, raised serpents twined in their hands. Most that survive are ceramic, but bronze versions likely gleamed in sacred shrines too, their shimmer lending power to fertility rites. Or think of the votive offerings found in caves across Europe, and the Levant miniature bronze axes, jewelry weapons deposited not for use, but for the gods. People were giving up precious metal, sometimes their best tools, not because they could spare them, but because they believed the sacrifice would buy favor in return. And in burials, bronze objects carried the sacred into the afterlife. Bronze daggers laid beside kings. Bronze cauldrons filled with offerings. Bronze jewelry adorning the dead. In the minds of mourners, these items weren't just wealth, they were passports to eternity. The artistry of sacred bronze reached remarkable heights. In Mesopotamia, the lost wax casting technique was perfected to create vessels decorated with intricate geometric and animal designs. The tomb of Queen Puabi at Ur yielded bronze pieces so detailed, delicate figurines, geometric filigree, that even modern metallurgists marvel at their precision. These weren't tools for plowing fields or hacking enemies. They were offerings to gods, proof of human devotion poured out in molten form. Bronze's role in temples also reinforced social order. Priests and rulers controlled the smiths, who supplied the ritual vessels and idols. Worshippers saw bronze glittering on the altar and were reminded of who had access to such divine materials. Every gleaming cauldron was both a sacred object and a social statement. This is power. This is authority. This is what separates the chosen from the rest. And yet, for ordinary people, there must have been something awe-inspiring too. Imagine standing in a temple, lit only by flickering lamps, the bronze idol before you, glowing like its alive shadows dancing across its polished surface. You might not understand metallurgy. You might not even own a single bronze tool. But in that moment, the divine shimmered close enough to touch. So bronze was never just metal. It was the eternal captured in earthly form. It tilled fields at armed warriors, but it also linked humans to gods. Every idol, every vessel, every votive axe told people that bronze belonged not just to kings or smiths, but to heaven. The fields may have been worked by bronze plows, but the temples glowed with bronze idols. And in that glow, humanity began to imagine permanence, power, and divinity cast in metal. If the Bronze Age had a beating heart, it was Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, where bronze tools, bronze weapons, and bronze treasures fueled the rise of kings and the invention of the state itself. Here among irrigation canals and ziggurats, civilization stepped into a new phase, not just villages or cities, but empires. Picture Uruk, around 3200 BC, already the world's first true metropolis. 40,000 people crowded behind walls, temple complexes towering above them, scribes scratching away on clay tablets, barley wool oil, and yes, bronze, all carefully accounted for. The white temple gleamed on its platform, and somewhere nearby, smiths hammered out the tools that kept this city running. The city wasn't just a place to live. It was an engine, and bronze was one of its pistons. The new alloy meant more than tools and ornaments. It meant armies, disciplined, equipped, terrifying. Around 2334, BC, Sargon of Akkad marched out from his city-state and carved the world's first empire. His soldiers carried bronze-tipped spears and axes, their weapons mass-produced in state-controlled workshops. They fought in formations disciplined and drilled, while Sargon boasted of conquering the four corners of the world. The truth bronze made it possible. Without standardized weapons, there is no standardized army. Without armies, there is no empire. The empire also needed administrators, and here bronze crept into bureaucracy. Clay tablets from this period record not just barley rations, but also the distribution of copper and tin ingots of bronze tools to work gangs. The temple granaries and palace storehouses became protobanks, controlling the flow of metal as carefully as they did food. To wield bronze wasn't just to wield a sword, it was to hold a ledger. Law, too, became etched in bronze, literally and figuratively. The Code of Ur-Nammu, around 2100 BC, and later Hammurabi's famous code in Babylon C, 1750 BC, were inscribed on stone stelae, but they referred constantly to property contracts and penalties involving metal. If your bronze tool was stolen, there was a fine. If you damaged someone's bronze equipment, there was a penalty. In a sense, the law was keeping pace with technology, new wealth, new tools, new crimes, new rules. Meanwhile, temples were dripping with bronze fittings. The doors of sanctuaries swung on bronze hinges, altars glowed with bronze vessels, idols stared from polished bronze eyes. In Ur, the royal cemetery yielded helmets and weapons made of bronze buried with kings and queens as tokens of their authority. Queen Puabi, laid to rest around 2600 BC, was surrounded not only by golden jewelry, but by bronze artifacts that proclaimed her power, both earthly and divine. Mesopotamian kings understood the message. Bronze wasn't just utility, it was propaganda. Marching at the head of an army clad in bronze armor, a king became more than a man. He became a symbol of divine favor. His weapons gleamed in the sun. His soldiers bristled with bronze-tipped spears. His banners shone with bronze finials. In a world where most people still lived with mud brick walls and clay bowls, the sight must have been overwhelming. And let's not forget the everyday impact. Farmers around Babylon wielded bronze plows that made their fields more productive. Canal diggers cut earth with bronze hoes, their sweat feeding the city's granaries. Craftsmen shaped bronze chisels to carve stone bronze drills to bore holes in wood. The city's very infrastructure, the walls, the temples, the irrigation canals stood on bronze tools as much as on human labor. But behind all this glitter lay fragility. Mesopotamian empires depended on trade for tin. Without it, their workshops went silent. That dependency meant politics and warfare often turned on controlling trade routes, mines, and merchants. Sargon's empire, the Akkadian state, eventually fell to pressures it couldn't manage: drought, rebellion, and invasions. The bronze weapons that had carved an empire couldn't stop the climate or the collapse of trade, yet the legacy endured. The idea of empire of rule enforced with bronze and written in law spread outward. Hammurabi of Babylon declared himself shepherd of his people, guardian of justice, and his stele showed him receiving authority from the god Shamash. But the real authority came from the bronze swords in his soldiers' hands, the bronze scales in his merchants' stalls, the bronze tools in his farmers' fields. Mesopotamia's empires remind us that bronze was never just a metal. It was a system. Armies' laws, temples, trade, agriculture, all bound together by a shimmering alloy that was stronger than stone, rarer than wood, and more enduring than clay. Civilization in the Tigris and Euphrates Valley wasn't written in ink. It was hammered in bronze. If Mesopotamia was the restless heart of the Bronze Age, Egypt was its golden crown. Along the Nile, where the river's flood brought life to the desert each year, bronze helped transform a patchwork of villages into one of the most dazzling civilizations the world has ever seen. And in true Egyptian style, they made their bronze shine alongside gold stone and the eternal sun. The story begins with unification. Around 3100 BC, the legendary king Narmer bound Upper and Lower Egypt together. His carved palette shows him smiting enemies, wearing the crowns of both regions' bronze-tipped mace in hand. Whether ceremonial or practical, the message was clear. Bronze was authority. To wield it was to rule. As Egypt entered the Old Kingdom, the great pyramid builders set about their monumental projects. We tend to imagine gangs of laborers hacking stone with clumsy tools, but the reality is subtler. Bronze chisels, saws, and drills were the hidden heroes of pyramid construction. At Saqqara, tools left behind by workers include bronze chisels worn to nubs from cutting limestone, their edges hardened by hammering to extend their life. Bronze saws fitted with sand as an abrasive cut through granite blocks weighing tons. Even the levers and measuring rods that aligned the blocks may have had bronze fittings. Without metal's durability, the dream of pyramids 146 meters tall, like Khufu's at Giza, would have remained just that, a dream. But Egypt's relationship with bronze went beyond construction. It was woven into daily life. Farmers guided plows with bronze shares. Harvesters wielded bronze sickles. Carpenters used bronze adzes to shape wood into boats and furniture. In the kitchens of the wealthy, bronze knives sliced bread and meat. In temples, bronze cauldrons steamed with offerings. For a civilization obsessed with order, may at the principle of balance, bronze was a tool that kept everything in its rightful place. It was also, inevitably, a weapon. Egyptian armies marched with bronze-tipped spears, shields reinforced with bronze bosses, and axes designed both for cutting wood and cleaving through enemy armor. In the Old and Middle Kingdoms, Egyptian power spread south into Nubia and north into the Levant campaigns, sustained by bronze blades gleaming under the desert sun. Soldiers carried khopesh, curved sickle swords, cast from bronze, terrifying in close combat. The weapon itself became iconic, shown in tomb paintings, and wielded by the gods in myth. Of course, Egypt was as much about symbols as about function. Bronze, polished to a golden sheen, appeared in statues, ritual objects, and jewelry. Pharaohs were buried with bronze daggers, not because they planned to fight in the afterlife, but because bronze embodied power, permanence, and protection. In tombs at Abydos, and later in the Valley of the Kings, bronze objects lay beside golden ones, reminders that utility and divinity walked hand in hand. And let's not forget the priests. Temples across Egypt, at Karnak, Memphis. Thebes glowed with bronze fixtures. Rituals required finely cast libation vessels, censers, and fittings that could withstand repeated use. Bronze mirrors reflected lamplight in dim sanctuaries, symbols of clarity and eternity. For a culture that believed gods demanded daily offerings, bronze was part of the very machinery of devotion. Yet, as in Mesopotamia, bronze was not for everyone. Elites monopolized access. Palaces and temples controlled smelting workshops and distribution. Ordinary farmers might use bronze-tipped tools if lucky, but often they still relied on wood or stone. To own bronze in quantity was to be wealthy or to serve the pharaoh himself. The material was a badge of status, a gleam that separated the divine king and his officials from the dusty masses. Still, even the masses saw the effects. The pyramids rose. Canals were dug. Crops multiplied. Egyptian civilization reached heights that still astonish us today. And bronze was there, at every stage, not always in the spotlight, but always in the hands of the workers who built the empire and the priests who sanctified it. By the time of the New Kingdom, Egypt had become a superpower, its armies thundering across Canaan and Nubia, its temples overflowing with wealth. Bronze weapons were carried in chariots at battles like Megiddo and Kadesh, where thousands of warriors clashed under banners of pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramses II. Reliefs carved into temple walls show the gleam of bronze helmets, axes, and swords propaganda in stone, reminding subjects that Egypt's might flowed from divine kingship and shining metal alike. And yet, for all Egypt's power, there was vulnerability. Like Mesopotamia, Egypt did not have abundant tin. Copper came from Sinai and Nubia, but tin had to be imported. That meant dependence on trade routes stretching hundreds of miles. The lifeblood of bronze ran through foreign lands and foreign seas, a reminder that even mighty pharaohs could not command geology. Still, when we think of Egypt's grandeur, the pyramids, the temples, the golden death mask of Tutankhamun, we should also think of the humbler bronze chisel saws and sickles that made it all possible. Gold-dazzled stone endured, but bronze did the work. It was the invisible scaffolding of Egypt's greatness. So the Nile's kingdom gleamed, its rulers wrapped in gold, its armies armed in bronze. Civilization had found in this alloy not just utility, but majesty. And as Egypt reached out to conquer and trade, it joined a Bronze Age club of great power states bound together by the same alloy, the same hunger, and the same fate. North of Mesopotamia, west of the Levant, a new contender rose from the rugged highlands of Anatolia. They were not as ancient as Sumer, nor as dazzling as Egypt, but by the 2nd millennium BC, the Hittites had carved themselves into history with bronze weapons, walled fortresses, and an empire that would stand toe-to-toe with the greatest powers of the age. Anatolia was rich in resources, especially copper, and its mountains offered natural fortresses. By around 1650 BC, the Hittites had consolidated power under kings ruling from their capital at Hattusa. Perched high on a rocky plateau, Hattusa bristled with stone walls, gates adorned with lions and sphinxes, and storehouses filled with grain and weapons. Step into one of its armories, and you would have seen racks of bronze-tipped spears, shields reinforced with bronze fittings, and chariots prepared for war. This was no backwater kingdom. This was a military state forged in bronze. The Hittites understood something fundamental in a Bronze Age world. Weapons meant diplomacy. They fought, yes, but they also negotiated. Their archives are stuffed with treaties written on clay tablets, some of the earliest international agreements we know. And when they signed those treaties with Egypt or Babylon, the Hittite kings were respected as equals. Why? Because behind their words stood armies glittering with bronze. And what armies they were! The Hittites perfected the use of the chariot as a battlefield weapon. Their chariots were heavier than the Egyptians, designed to carry 3 men instead of 2, driver, shield bearer, and warrior armed with bronze-tipped spears or arrows. It was like fielding a mobile strike team thundering across the plains. At the Battle of Kadesh, around 1274 BC, thousands of these chariots clashed with Egyptian forces under Ramses II in what may have been the largest chariot battle in history. Imagine the earth shaking under the hooves of horses, the flash of bronze weapons in the sun, the cries of warriors echoing across the Orontes River Valley. The Hittite state wasn't just about brute force, though. Its organization was surprisingly modern. Records show detailed inventories of bronze goods, allocations of ingots to smiths, and centralized workshops that turned ore into standardized weapons. Bronze wasn't just crafted, it was managed, counted, and controlled by palace administrators. To keep an empire standing, you needed not only warriors, but also supply chains, and the Hittites ran theirs like professionals. Religion, too, glowed with bronze. Hittite temples housed idols and ritual vessels cast from the alloy, offered to their storm gods and sun goddesses. In ceremonies, bronze cauldrons simmered with offerings, while bronze figurines stood as intermediaries between mortals and the divine. The smith's fire wasn't only for war, it was also for worship. But as with all Bronze Age states, the Hittites lived with an Achilles heel tin. Their lands gave copper in abundance, but tin had to travel from far away, possibly from Central Asia, or even Cornwall, filtered through trade routes that could be disrupted by war or politics. Without tin, their bronze advantage faltered. Their survival depended on far-off mines and the fragile web of trade caravans and sea lanes. For centuries, though, the system held. The Hittites became one of the great powers club of the late Bronze Age, a fraternity of empires that included Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, and Mitanni. They sent envoys, exchanged daughters in marriage, and even traded luxury goods, gold from Egypt, lapis from Afghanistan, and bronze weapons from Anatolia. It was a diplomatic ballet, each empire watching the others, each aware that behind the polite letters and gifts lay armies clad in bronze. The Hittites left their mark not only in treaties and battles, but in culture. They preserved myths and law codes on clay tablets, blending Anatolian traditions with Mesopotamian influence. They borrowed writing systems, worshipped storm gods, and stamped their lion gates with authority that still impresses today. Walk through the Lion Gate at Hattusa, and you can almost hear the clatter of chariot wheels on stone, the creak of leather harnesses, the metallic chorus of bronze weapons at the ready. And yet, for all their strength, the Hittites were not eternal. By the late 13th century, BC pressures mounted internal strife, rebellious provinces, and the mysterious waves of invaders we now call the Sea Peoples. Around 1180, BC Hattusa was burned and abandoned. The empire collapsed, its archives scattered, its walls crumbling. The Great Powers Club lost a member, and the balance of the Bronze Age world tilted. Still, the Hittites remind us of a truth in the Bronze Age. Greatness wasn't just about geography or crops. It was about control of bronze itself, how you armed your armies, how you equipped your chariots, how you impressed allies and terrified enemies. For a few shining centuries, the Hittites mastered that game, and their bronze-forged legacy still echoes in the ruins of Hattusa. While the Hittites thundered across Anatolia in their chariots, another Bronze Age civilization was quietly flourishing on an island to the south. Crete, the jewel of the Aegean, became home to the Minoans, a people less obsessed with conquest and more enamored with trade art and palatial splendor. If the Hittites were the soldiers of the Bronze Age, the Minoans were its architects and artists, building not walls and fortresses, but sprawling palaces that shimmered like labyrinths in the Mediterranean sun. Knossos, their greatest city, wasn't just a palace. It was an entire complex, thousands of rooms arranged in twisting corridors, courtyards open to the sky storerooms, stacked with giant pithoi jars of oil and grain. The walls were painted with frescoes so vivid that even fragments still glow after 3.5 millennia. Dolphins leaping in blue seas, youths vaulting over bulls, women in flounced skirts with curling hair. It was a world intoxicated with color and movement, more dance than drill, more ritual than regiment. And bronze was everywhere. Tools shaped the stones of the palace. Bronze adzes carved wooden beams that held ceilings in place. Bronze chisels etched fine details into plaster. Artisans mixed pigments with bronze mortars and pestles. Even the bull-leaping scenes may have been trained with bronze rings, fittings, and ornaments. If Mesopotamian bronze went into weapons and Egypt's into monuments, Crete poured its bronze into beauty. The Minoans were masters of the sea. Their ships, sleek and fast, darted across the Aegean, carrying amphorae filled with oil wine and perhaps honey. In return, they brought back copper from Cyprus, tin from Anatolia, ivory from Africa, and precious stones from the east. Their power wasn't built on bronze swords, but on bronze anchors, bronze fittings, and the quiet might of maritime trade. Some scholars even argue that Crete had no need for defensive walls. The sea was their moat, their navy, their shield. Still, the Minoans weren't naive. They forged bronze weapons, though often finely decorated, blurring the line between tool and artwork. Dagger blades from Crete, inlaid with gold and silver show hunting scenes of lions and gazelles so intricate they seem more like canvases than weapons. Perhaps they were used in ceremonies rather than combat. To the Minoans, bronze could be both deadly and dazzling, both instrument and ornament. Religion, too, shimmered with bronze. Figurines of goddesses, votive offerings shaped like double axes, labyrinths and ritual vessels were cast in the alloy. The gleam of polished bronze reflected torchlight in sacred caves and shrines, lending mystery to rites that blended nature, fertility, and the divine. It's not hard to see why later Greek myths set the story of the labyrinth here, with its half-man, half-bull minotaur. The palaces themselves were labyrinths bronze, glinting in their shadows. The Minoans also reveal something else about the Bronze Age, that a civilization could be powerful without being perpetually at war. While their contemporaries built fortresses, the Minoans built plumbing. Aqueducts and drainage channels threaded through Knossos, bringing fresh water and carrying waste away. Bathrooms with terracotta bathtubs and even flushing toilets remind us that luxury isn't only gold and jewels, it's running water. Bronze tools made it possible to shape and maintain this infrastructure, turning palaces into marvels of comfort as well as grandeur. But all palaces carry shadows. Around 1450, BC, Minoan civilization faltered. Many palaces were destroyed, possibly by earthquakes or invasions from Mycenaean mainlanders. And earlier, still around 1600 BC, the eruption of Thera-modern Santorini had sent tsunamis and ash clouds across the Aegean, devastating Cretan trade. Even a sea power couldn't always outsail nature. By the late Bronze Age, Crete's dominance had waned, and Mycenaean Greeks had taken over many of its palaces. Yet the memory of the Minoans lingered. Their art, their architecture, their myths became seeds for later Greek imagination. And the bronze tools and ornaments that survive tell us that this was a society where metal was not only about survival, but about style. They took the raw stuff of copper and tin and turned it into a civilization that danced, painted, and sailed its way into legend. So, as we leave the highlands of the Hittites and step onto the harbors of Knossos, we see another face of the Bronze Age. Not armies and treaties, but frescoes and festivals. Not endless wars, but palaces of the sea, where bronze glimmered less like a sword and more like the reflection of sunlight on the Mediterranean waves. If the Minoans gave the Bronze Age its frescoes, festivals, and labyrinthine palaces, the Mycenaeans gave it walls, weapons, and war. On the rocky hills of mainland Greece, around 1600 BC, a new power rose, one that admired Minoan artistry, but preferred to back it up with bronze swords and massive fortifications. These were the Mycenaeans later remembered in Homer's tales of heroes and sieges. And while those epics are embroidered with legend, their roots lie in a culture built from bronze. Approach Mycenae itself, perched on a hill in the Peloponnesus. Before you even enter, you're confronted by the Lion Gate, two carved lions standing above a great stone lintel, flanking a column that may symbolize the palace itself. The stones are so huge that later Greeks believed giant cyclopes must have built them. Behind those walls lay storerooms, packed with bronze weapons, workshops hammering out armor, and elite graves glittering with metal treasures. This was not a palace of dance like Knossos. This was a citadel of warriors. The Mycenaeans loved bronze weaponry. Engraved Circle A at Mycenae burials from around 1600 BC revealed a staggering horde, bronze swords and daggers inlaid with gold and silver, their blades etched with hunting scenes of lions and gazelles. Masks of beaten gold covered the faces of the dead, including the famous so-called Mask of Agamemnon. Alongside them lay bronze spearheads, arrowheads, and armor plates, enough to equip an army in miniature, all entombed to signal the power of those within. These weren't tools of farmers. They were the badges of a warrior elite. And war was very much their business. The Mycenaeans constructed citadels across Greece, Tiryns, Pylos, Athens, each one bristling with walls of Cyclopean stone, defended by bronze-armed soldiers. From these strongholds, they controlled surrounding farmland, extracted tribute, and launched expeditions overseas. Linear B tablets, the earliest form of written Greek record, meticulous inventories, so many suits of armor, so many chariots, so many bronze weapons. Bureaucrats tallied swords as carefully as barley proof that war and economy were inseparable. Chariots thundered in their service. Unlike the heavier Hittite models, the Mycenaean chariot was lighter built for speed and maneuver, often carrying archers armed with bronze-tipped arrows. Frescoes show warriors in chariots galloping into battle, their long spears gleaming, their helmets bristling with boar tusks. Behind them, infantry marched with large figure-of-8 shields, bronze daggers at their belts. It was a martial society through and through. Yet the Mycenaeans weren't only warriors. They were traders too, extending networks across the Aegean. From their harbors, ships sailed to Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant, carrying olive oil wine and pottery, returning with metals and luxuries. But unlike the Minoans, who seemed to prefer diplomacy and trade, the Mycenaeans didn't hesitate to use force. Archaeological layers in the eastern Mediterranean sometimes show Minoan-style goods, alongside evidence of destruction, perhaps peaceful trade, perhaps conquest. Bronze swords have a way of blurring that line. Religion was woven into this warrior culture as well. Temples at Mycenaean sites contained bronze figurines, votive weapons, and ritual vessels. Gods were invoked to bless harvests, but also to favor warriors in battle. Later, Greek mythology remembered this age as one of heroes: Achilles, Agamemnon, Odysseus, all larger than life, armed with gleaming bronze. Whether or not the Trojan War happened exactly as Homer sang, the cultural memory is telling. The Mycenaeans saw themselves as fighters destined for glory. And yet, their grandeur carried fragility. Around 1200 BC, as the wider Bronze Age world staggered into crisis, the Mycenaean citadels fell one by one. Fires gutted palaces. Linear B bureaucracies vanished, and Greece slid into what historians call the Dark Age. But for a few centuries, behind their Cyclopean walls, the Mycenaeans stood as bronze-clad warriors, wielding power by the sword, remembered ever after in epic song. So if Knossos was the labyrinth of dancers, Mycenae was the fortress of heroes. Palaces became citadels, frescoes became war trophies, and bronze once more found its sharpest edge in the hands of those who built their world behind walls. While Mycenaean warriors sharpened their bronze swords behind Cyclopean walls, another Bronze Age civilization was thriving far to the east, along the fertile plains of the Indus River. Here, in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, the Indus Valley Civilization, also called Harappan, flourished between 2600 and 1900 BC. And unlike the citadels of Greece or the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the Indus world left us something astonishingly modern: straight streets. standardized bricks, and plumbing. Step into Mohenjo-Daro, one of its greatest cities. The streets run in neat grids, wide enough for carts to pass. Houses built of baked bricks that all measure the same proportions line the avenues. Each home has access to a drainage system, covered sewers, running beneath the streets, carrying waste away. Some even have private bathrooms with terracotta pipes. In an age when most of the world still tossed waste into alleys, the Harappans had already cracked urban sanitation. Civilization, it turns out, sometimes begins with plumbing. Bronze was present here too, though in subtler ways. Harappan artisans cast bronze tools, chisels, knives, razors used by carpenters and farmers. They made ornaments of bronze bangles, pins, mirrors, small figurines. The most famous of these is the dancing girl from Mohenjo-Daro, a tiny bronze statue of a young woman naked, save for a stack of bangles, standing with one hand on her hip and the other dangling loosely, her posture relaxed, almost sassy. At just over 4 inches tall, she's a masterpiece of lost wax, casting her confidence radiating across 4,000 years. But the Indus Valley didn't cover its kings in gold masks or build towering ziggurats. In fact, what's most remarkable is what we don't see: no palaces, no giant temples, no obvious kings. The Harappan cities look egalitarian, their wealth more evenly spread. The standardized bricks suggest centralized planning, but without ostentatious monuments. Perhaps power was collective, perhaps hidden. The bronze artifacts we find jewelry tools, small figurines seem more about daily life than about elite display. That doesn't mean they lacked sophistication. Harappan craftsmen produced bronze weights for measuring trade goods, each weight standardized across vast distances. Their seals, tiny stone tablets carved with animals, and symbols sometimes had bronze fittings used to stamp clay and mark ownership. These seals are inscribed with a script we still can't read. Rows of mysterious symbols carved with precision remain undeciphered to this day. Was it writing? A ritual code? A trade notation? Until someone cracks it, the Harappans keep their secrets. Their economy thrived on trade. Harappan cities exported cotton textiles, beads, and ornaments, and imported metals, including copper and tin from distant lands. Archaeologists have found Harappan seals as far away as Mesopotamia, proof that ships and caravans carried their goods across deserts and seas. Imagine a Mesopotamian merchant in Ur opening a jar to find beads from Harappa, their surfaces gleaming like stars. In exchange, bronze tools and ingots may have made their way east, fueling workshops in the Indus cities. Religion and ritual also touched bronze. Small bronze figurines like the dancing girl likely had spiritual as well as aesthetic meaning. Bronze mirrors could have been used in ceremonies reflecting sunlight or firelight in ways that seemed magical. Some scholars think certain bronze objects were dedicated as votive offerings, though without deciphered texts, we can only speculate. What's clear is that bronze here wasn't solely the property of kings or warriors. It was part of everyday life: mirrors in houses, tools in workshops, ornaments on wrists. While Mesopotamian elites flaunted golden helmets and Egyptian pharaohs wore bronze-tipped crowns, the Indus Valley spread its metal more evenly, weaving it into the fabric of a society that seemed less concerned with hierarchy and more with order. And yet by 1900 BC, the great Indus cities declined. Climate change, shifting rivers, perhaps overexploitation of resources, all may have played a role. Populations dispersed, cities were abandoned, and the script fell silent. Bronze, still useful, continued on, but the civilization that had standardized its bricks and perfected its drains faded into obscurity. Still, their legacy is remarkable. In the Indus Valley, bronze helped shape a society where sanitation trade and urban planning mattered as much as kings and conquests. And the little bronze dancing girl hand on hip reminds us that civilization can be confident, playful, and stylish, even without golden masks or towering monuments. If the Indus Valley gave the Bronze Age its bricks and drains, China gave it its thunder. In the valleys of the Yellow River, beginning around 2000, BC bronze became more than a tool or weapon. Here, metallurgy blossomed into a full-blown art form, a sacred craft that defined kingship itself. Where Mesopotamia counted bronze ingots and Egypt wielded bronze sickle swords, China raised bronze to a cosmic level, casting it into vessels so massive, so intricate, they still command awe today. The story begins with the legendary Xia dynasty, traditionally dated around 2100–1600 BC. Archaeologists debate whether the Xia was truly the first Chinese dynasty, or partly myth, but sites like Erlitou show evidence of large-scale bronze production workshops, crucibles, molds, and finished artifacts. These weren't just knives and axes. They were ritual vessels, cauldrons, goblets, and cups used in ceremonies to honor ancestors and gods. Already, bronze wasn't just practical. It was sacred. By the Shang dynasty, c. 1600–1046, BC bronze had become the beating heart of Chinese civilization. In Anyang, the last Shang capital, archaeologists have uncovered entire foundries where thousands of workers smelted copper and tin, poured molten metal, and broke apart clay molds to reveal vessels of stunning complexity. The Shang perfected the piece mold casting technique. Instead of lost wax, they carved intricate designs into clay molds, assembled them around a core, and poured in the metal. The result? Vessels covered in crisp, detailed motifs, spirals, dragons, Taoidi masks, with staring eyes that still seem alive today. These bronzes weren't for eating or drinking in the everyday sense. They were for rituals, sacrifices to ancestors, feasts for the spirits. The Shang believed their rulers held power because they could communicate with the divine, and bronze vessels were the medium. Imagine a Shang king standing before a towering cauldron, wine or blood steaming inside, smoke curling upward as drums pounded. The gleam of the vessel wasn't just aesthetic, it was authority made visible. And the scale was staggering. Some ritual tripods weighed hundreds of kilograms, requiring teams to lift them. These weren't portable. They were monument statements of wealth and power. To own such bronzes was to declare dominion not just over people, but over the resources, labor, and skill needed to make them. When Shang kings died, they were buried with bronzes by the hundreds, along with jade ornaments, chariots, and even sacrifice servants. The message to the afterlife was clear. Our power endures, as enduring as bronze itself. Weapons, too, gleamed in Shang hands. Bronze axes, spears, and dagger axes, G-filled armories, their forms, as distinctive as their artistry. Soldiers marched with bronze-tipped halberds, chariots rolled with bronze fittings, and the king's armies fought with a sharpness unmatched by stone. The elite wore bronze bells that jingled as they rode, turning battle into a pageant of sound and spectacle. But perhaps the most extraordinary feature of the Shang Bronze Age was its connection to writing and divination. Oracle bones, turtle shells, and ox scapulae carved with early Chinese characters were heated until they cracked the cracks, interpreted as messages from ancestors. The questions inscribed often concerned harvests, weather war, and sacrifices conducted with bronze vessels. In this way, metallurgy, writing, and religion fused into a single system of power. The king was mediator between heaven and earth, and bronze was his proof. The Zhou dynasty, which followed the Shang, carried this further. Around 1046 BC, after defeating the Shang, the Zhou proclaimed the mandate of heaven, a divine justification for rule. And how did they display this mandate with bronzes? Enormous cauldrons known as ding became symbols of authority. Zhou kings cast inscriptions into their bronzes, recording victories, decrees, and genealogies. In a sense, these vessels were both monument and manuscript, their gleaming surfaces carrying words into eternity. And here lies a profound contrast. In Mesopotamia, bronze was tallied by scribes. In Egypt, bronze built monuments. In China, bronze was the monument, the text, the ritual, the throne. Even today, the character for metal in Chinese, Jin Jin, carries the echo of this ancient reverence. But as everywhere, the system depended on resources. Copper came from mines in Henan Shanxi and beyond, while tin had to be sourced through long-distance trade. Foundries guzzled fuel forests were stripped for charcoal, and laborers sweated to feed the furnaces. Behind every magnificent ritual vessel lay mountains scarred by mining and landscapes reshaped by human hunger for metal. Still, the legacy is undeniable. The bronzes of Shang and Zhou China remain some of the most sophisticated ever cast, their artistry unmatched, their symbolism profound. They weren't simply tools or weapons. They were embodiments of order, of ancestry, of cosmic connection. To stand before one is to feel the weight not just of metal, but of meaning. So while the West's Bronze Age gave us empires and epics, China's gave us a bronze culture so steeped in ritual and symbolism that it shaped a civilization's worldview for millennia. Bronze wasn't just an age here. It was a cosmos cast in molten fire, enduring long after the kings who commissioned it crumbled to dust. While China was casting colossal ritual vessels, and Mesopotamia was writing laws on clay, Europe was quietly forging its own Bronze Age identity. Across the continent, from the Danube plains to the misty shores of Britain, people were discovering the alloy's power and weaving it into their lives, sometimes for glory, sometimes for trade, and sometimes just to look good at the village feast. It began with small steps. Around 2500 BC, the so-called bell beaker culture spread across Western and Central Europe, named for its distinctive pottery shaped like inverted bells. But along with their ceramics, these communities carried knowledge of copper and bronze. Graves from this period often contained copper daggers, wrist guards for archery, and ornaments of gold and bronze. One of the most famous is the Amesbury archer, buried near Stonehenge around 2300 BC. His grave held copper knives, gold ornaments, and stone wrist guards, a fusion of old and new stone and metal, showing how Europe stood on the threshold between ages. Over time, bronze became more common, more essential. Communities that once traded only in flint now exchanged bronze axes, sickles, and ornaments. And just like in the Near East, those who controlled access to metal often rose above the rest. Chiefs flaunted bronze weapons as signs of status, burying themselves with swords and jewelry to ensure their prestige lasted into eternity. Farmers, meanwhile, prized bronze sickles and plows that made fields more productive, freeing them from the limits of stone. Europe's Bronze Age wasn't uniform. In the Aegean, Mycenaeans fortified citadels and filled their graves with gold. In Scandinavia, people carved ships and spirals into rock, their artwork glowing with symbolism of sun and sea. In Central Europe, hill forts rose on ridges defended by warriors with bronze swords. Each region put its own spin on the alloy, adapting it to landscapes and traditions. But across these diverse cultures, bronze carried common themes: prestige, connection, and ritual. Hoards of bronze objects, swords, axes, ornaments have been found buried in rivers, bogs, and fields. These weren't discarded trash. They were deliberate deposits, sacrifices to the gods or spirits of the land. To give up bronze was to give up wealth, proof of devotion that still puzzles archaeologists today. Imagine the solemnity, a chief lowering a gleaming sword into a river, watching it vanish beneath the current, trusting that the offering would buy favor from powers unseen. Trade stitched Europe into broader networks. Amber from the Baltic traveled south, traded for bronze and gold. Tin from Cornwall made its way to the continent, fueling the demand for stronger alloys. Seas and rivers became highways of exchange, carrying not just goods, but ideas. The spread of metalwork styles, the way sword hilts were shaped, the designs etched into axes, reveals communities and conversation across hundreds of miles. Europe's Bronze Age was less isolated than we might imagine. It was part of a continent-wide dialogue in metal. And let's not forget the everyday. For all the grand burials and ritual deposits, most people experience bronze in humbler ways: a pin fastening clothing, a small knife at the hearth, a sickle cutting grain. These objects passed from hand to hand were part of daily rhythms, quietly transforming how people lived. Archaeology gives us glimpses of these worlds. At Unetics in Central Europe, graves from around 2000 BC reveal elites buried with bronze daggers, gold ornaments, and amber beads, while nearby burials hold simpler goods. At Wessex in Britain, chieftains were laid to rest with daggers, decorated pottery, and jewelry, their graves showing ties to continental trade. These finds remind us that Europe's Bronze Age wasn't a single story, but a mosaic of communities, each shining with the alloy's glow in its own way. What unites them all is the sense that bronze was more than just a tool. It was a marker of identity, of connection, of belief. Whether buried in rivers, worn as jewelry, or wielded as weapons, bronze objects carried meaning beyond their use. They were symbols of status, tokens of devotion, and links in a growing chain of trade that bound Europe together. So as we move through Europe's Bronze Age, we see not just warriors and chiefs, but entire worlds, reshaped villages, farms, rituals, and relationships, all glinting with the warm shine of copper and tin. It was a patchwork of cultures, each reflecting the alloy in different ways, yet all part of the great Bronze Age story that stretched from the Baltic to the Aegean. Far to the north, where the Baltic winds whip over forests and fjords, the Bronze Age took on a flavor all its own. Scandinavia had no great cities, like Uruk, no pyramids, like Giza, no palaces like Knossos. What it did have was amber trade routes and a culture that poured its imagination into art, ritual, and the sea. This was the Nordic Bronze Age, lasting from roughly 1700 to 500 BC, and it gave us some of the most evocative images of the entire era. The first thing to understand is that Scandinavia had little copper or tin of its own. Every bronze object had to arrive through long-distance trade, paid for, with something the North had in abundance: amber. That golden fossilized resin, glowing like trapped sunlight, became the North's currency. Traders carried it south, exchanging it for ingots of copper and tin. In return, bronze objects flowed back: swords, axes, ornaments, and vessels. To hold bronze in Denmark or Sweden was to hold proof of connection to distant lands: Italy, Central Europe, even the Mediterranean. And oh, what they made of it. Step onto a Scandinavian cliff face, and you'll find rock carvings, petroglyphs, etched into the stone, ships with curved prows, warriors with swords, spirals, wheels, and sun symbols. Some carvings show longboats with rows of oars, their hulls filled with warriors as if fleets were sailing forever across the rock. Others depict rituals, processions, or duels. The imagery tells us that in the north, the sea and the sun were central, and bronze was woven into their symbolism. One of the most spectacular finds is the Trundholm sun chariot discovered in Denmark. A small bronze horse pulls a gilded bronze disc mounted on wheels, an artistic vision of the sun being drawn across the sky. The disk's two faces are telling one gilded shining for the day, the other dark for the night. Here, bronze wasn't just a metal. It was cosmic, a medium to depict the eternal dance of light and darkness. Imagine the awe of seeing such a figure in a ritual, its golden side glinting in firelight, embodying the very source of life. Music, too, rang with bronze. The famous lures, long curved bronze horns, were cast with exquisite precision. When blown, they produced deep resonant tones that could echo across valleys. Were they used in battle and ritual, or both, perhaps all three? Imagine a misty dawn, warriors gathering, the haunting call of bronze horns rising like the voice of gods. Even today, when replicas are played, their sound is eerie and commanding, as if pulled from another world. Burials reveal the Nordic love of ceremony. Warriors were interred with bronze swords, women with bronze jewelry, spiral arm rings, fibulae belts. Some graves contained entire sets of tools and ornaments suggesting status and wealth. Ships carved into rocks often accompany burial sites, as if the dead were imagined sailing to the afterlife on gleaming bronze vessels. And while warfare loomed large, ritual dominated. Hordes of bronze objects have been found deliberately deposited in bogs and lakes. Swords, bent axes, broken ornaments scattered. These were offerings, sacrifices to unseen powers. Imagine standing on a lake's edge, the surface still and dark, lowering a bronze sword into the water while chanting to the sun or sky. To give up such wealth was no small act. It was devotion written in metal gifts meant for gods. What's striking about the Nordic Bronze Age is the artistry. Swords were cast with elegant hilts, sometimes inlaid with gold, or decorated with spirals. Shields of bronze gleamed like suns themselves. Even simple tools were shaped with care, their curves pleasing to the eye. It was as if every object carried meaning, not just function. Yet for all its sophistication, this was still a world of small communities, villages of farmers and herders, their lives tied to the rhythm of seasons. Bronze gave them sharper tools for farming ornaments, for display weapons, for defense. But it also gave them a way to connect to the cosmos, to imagine the sun's journey, to sing through horns, to carve ships sailing into eternity. In the Nordic Bronze Age, bronze wasn't about empires or bureaucracy. It was about myth and memory, ritual and rhythm. It turned the North into a landscape of symbols, where the sea carried not only ships, but ideas, and where bronze shone as a bridge between humans and the divine. By the late Bronze Age, around 1300-800 BC, Europe's landscape was changing again. The great trading networks still pulsed amber, and tin still flowed and bronze still gleamed, but the way people lived and buried their dead took on new forms. This was the world of Hillfort's sprawling fields, and the Urnfield culture, a name that comes not from poetry, but from the endless rows of urns filled with ashes, silent witnesses to a society in transition. Let's start with the forts. Across Central Europe, hilltops were crowned with massive fortified settlements. These weren't just military outposts. They were bustling centers of power trade and craft. Wooden palisades and earthworks encircled homes, workshops, and storehouses. From their heights, you could survey the surrounding fields and valleys, controlling not just the land, but the people who worked it. Archaeologists at sites like Hüneberg in modern Germany have found evidence of planned layouts with streets, walls, and specialized zones. Bronze was forged here in workshops poured into molds for swords, sickles, and ornaments, while merchants tallied goods in storerooms. The hill fort was the Bronze Age city of Central Europe, smaller than Uruk or Knossos, but just as vital to its world. And the fields. Agriculture had spread across the continent long before, but now bronze tools gave it new efficiency. Sickles with serrated bronze blades harvested grain more quickly. Plowshares dug deeper into soil. With food surpluses, hill forts grew, population swelled, and trade intensified. The rhythm of life was set by the season's plow-sow-reap store, always with bronze tools in hand. Then the burials. The urn-field culture, stretching from the Danube to the Rhine and beyond, transformed funerary practice. Instead of burying the dead intact, communities cremated them, placing the ashes in pottery urns. These urns, sometimes plain, sometimes decorated, were buried in vast cemeteries, often with bronze ornaments or weapons beside them. Imagine walking among rows of small mounds, each marking a life reduced to ash, each urn containing fragments of bone and a few treasured objects. It was a quiet revolution. In belief, fire, not earth, now carried the dead to the afterlife. What's striking is the scale. Some urnfield cemeteries contain thousands of burials, row upon row, generation upon generation. This wasn't just an elite practice, it was communal. Men, women, children, all reduced to ash, all placed in urns. The democracy of death? Perhaps, but still marked by inequality. Some urns held fine bronze swords, others only simple ornaments. Even an ash status gleamed. The bronze weapons of this period were masterpieces. Swords with elegant leaf-shaped blades, balanced for both thrusting and slashing. Spearheads socketed for stronger shafts. Shields of bronze hammered into discs that shone like mirrors. These weren't rough tools. They were products of specialized smiths, often decorated, sometimes deliberately bent or broken before being placed in graves or hoards. To destroy a weapon like this was to make a statement: wealth sacrificed power given to the gods. Hoards became common. Across Europe, caches of bronze, axes, swords, and ornaments have been found buried in fields or sunk into rivers. Some may have been hidden in times of danger, never recovered. Others seemed deliberate offerings, wealth taken out of circulation as ritual sacrifice. Picture a warrior chief lowering a gleaming sword into a river at dusk, the ripple swallowing its shine, a gift to unseen forces that ruled life and death. But the hill forts and urns also hint at turbulence. Fortifications suggest fear of raids or rivalry between groups. Weapons and graves suggest a society where warriors carried prestige. And mass cremation cemeteries suggest new ideas about community and the afterlife, spreading widely, reshaping traditions. The late Bronze Age in Europe was vibrant, but also tense, alive with innovation, and shadowed by conflict. In the end, the urnfield culture set the stage for what came next. From its networks and traditions grew the Hallstatt and Latin cultures of the Iron Age, the Celtic worlds, that would later challenge Rome itself. But the roots lay here in forts, on hilltops, in fields worked with bronze, and in cemeteries filled with urns of ash, each one a reminder of lives lived in a world where bronze was both ordinary and extraordinary. Here's the next part, steering us toward the Atlantic edge of the Bronze Age world. At the far western reaches of Europe, where Atlantic waves crash against rocky coasts, the Bronze Age left behind stories of mystery, monument, and metal. Britain and Iberia, distant from the great cities of the Near East, still pulsed with the same alloy of copper and tin, shaping lives, rituals, and landscapes in ways that remain as fascinating as they are enigmatic. Let's start in Britain, where the shadow of Stonehenge still stretched long into the Bronze Age. The great stones had been raised in the late Neolithic, but by the time bronze arrived, the monument's use had shifted. Around its circles, archaeologists find burials filled with bronze daggers, pins, and ornaments. The Amesbury archer, discovered just miles from Stonehenge, was buried around 2300 BC with copper knives, golden ornaments, and stone wrist guards. His grave whispers of a man who knew the value of bronze and perhaps helped spread its secrets into the islands. Bronze soon transformed Britain. Axes, swords, and sickles appeared in hoards and graves. Jewelry gleamed in the form of torques, pins, and bracelets. The Wessex culture, centered in southern England, left graves filled with bronze goods, amber beads, and exotic ornaments that hint at long-distance trade. The people of Britain were plugged into networks that stretched all the way to the Mediterranean. Tin from Cornwall, yes, those windswept cliffs and moors, was a precious export feeding the furnaces of faraway empires. Without Cornwall's tin, the Bronze Age might have faltered. But bronze in Britain wasn't just practical. It was symbolic. Across the landscape, Barrow's burial mounds dot the hills, many containing weapons and ornaments that were never meant to be used again. Rivers, too, swallowed bronze offerings, swords, axes, and spears, deliberately cast into their depths. Imagine a warrior standing on the bank of the Thames at dawn, lowering his sword into the water, the ripples carrying it away as a gift to spirits unseen. In a land of mist and stone, bronze became a bridge between people and the sacred. Now let's sail south to Iberia, modern Spain, and Portugal, where the Bronze Age shone in its own way. Here, fortified settlements sprouted on hilltops, their stone walls overlooking fertile valleys. The El Arger culture, flourishing in southeastern Spain, around 2200–1500 BC, built some of the earliest urban centers in Western Europe. In their graves, we find bronze daggers, swords, and jewelry, sometimes buried with elites in large pithos jars. The sheer quantity of weapons suggests a society where warriors held prestige, where bronze wasn't just wealth, but identity. Trade bound Iberia into the wider Bronze Age world. Copper flowed from the mines of Rio Tinto and tin from Galicia, both feeding Mediterranean markets. Phoenician traders would later sail these coasts in search of metals. But even earlier, Iberia was exporting ore and finished goods. Bronze linked Iberia to Crete Mycenae and beyond its coasts, dotted with harbors where ships exchanged ingots for amber ivory and luxury items. Iberia also gave us treasures of astonishing artistry. The treasure of Villena, discovered in southeastern Spain, contains nearly 10 kilograms of gold and a wealth of bronze and silver objects, bowls, bracelets, bottles. The hoard suggests elites who flaunted their wealth in shimmering displays as dazzling as anything in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Nearby, the treasure of El Carambolo reveals ornate ornaments, perhaps tied to early Phoenician influences, showing how Iberia's shores became crossroads of cultures. Rituals, too, were steeped in bronze. Hoards of weapons buried in caves, ornaments deposited in rivers' axes, stored in hidden caches, all speak of offerings to gods or ancestors. The Atlantic coast in particular seems to echo with these rituals, its storms and tides inspiring reverence. To throw bronze into the sea was to give it back to the elements to appease powers that ruled both harvest and voyage. Yet as in Britain, everyday life was never far from the extraordinary. Farmers plowed fields with bronze-tipped tools, herders carried bronze knives, women adorned themselves with bronze jewelry that shone in firelight. These weren't empires with scribes and ziggurats, but they were vibrant societies tightly bound to the rhythms of land and sea, enriched by metal that traveled farther than most people ever would. By the late Bronze Age, both Britain and Iberia stood as crucial nodes in a vast network stretching across Europe and the Mediterranean. Their tin and copper fueled distant empires. Their hoards and treasures reveal beliefs as complex as any temple cult. And their monuments, Stonehenge's silent stones, Iberia's fortified hills, still stand today, reminders that even at the edge of the known world, bronze worked its quiet magic. It's tempting to see the Bronze Age only in terms of glittering treasures, soaring palaces, and armies bristling with swords. But behind the shine was a bill one paid not in gold or tin, but in forests, soil, and climate. Civilization was booming, yes, but it was also burning quite literally through its resources. Start with the furnaces. To smelt copper and tin, you needed heat, immense heat. And to feed that heat, you needed charcoal. And to make charcoal, you needed trees. Vast forests across Anatolia, the Levant, and Europe were cut down their trunks, stacked and burned to create fuel. Imagine the scale. Every bronze axe, every sword, every sickle required the consumption of dozens, sometimes hundreds of trees. Multiply that by thousands of years, and you begin to see how entire landscapes were stripped bare. Archaeological pollen records tell the tale. In parts of the Near East forests, vanish from the record right around the height of Bronze Age metallurgy, replaced by grasses and scrub. In Central Europe, too, tree cover declines sharply as smelting centers churned out metal. Hillsides were logged until they eroded topsoil, washing away into rivers, leaving scarred ground behind. The price of bronze wasn't just human labor. It was ecosystems reshaped, sometimes ruined. Agriculture supercharged by bronze plows had its own costs. Fields expanded, irrigation networks spread, and surpluses grew. But irrigation left behind salt deposits in Mesopotamia's soil, slowly turning fertile fields white and barren. Deforestation meant less rainfall in some regions, erosion in others. What seemed like progress was also fragility, a delicate balance that could tip with a few bad harvests. And tip it did. Around 2200 BC, the world experienced what scholars call the 4.2 kiloyear event, a period of sudden climate change that brought drought across much of the Old World. In Mesopotamia, harvests shrank, cities emptied, and the Akkadian Empire collapsed. In Egypt, the Old Kingdom's Pyramid Age ended, giving way to famine and unrest. Even the Indus Valley felt the strain, its rivers shifting and its cities beginning to falter. For centuries, civilization staggered under the weight of climate's whims. The lesson was clear, even if no one at the time could articulate it. Complex societies depended on fragile systems. Too much deforestation, too much irrigation, too little rain, and suddenly cities built on bronze and barley cracked apart. Nature, indifferent to kings and armies, could unmake what human ingenuity had built. Later, around 1200 BC, another wave of environmental stress rippled across the Mediterranean. Drought struck again this time, compounded by war migration and collapsing trade networks. Crops failed, caravans faltered, and hungry peoples moved in search of new lands. Inscriptions from Egypt describe enemies coming from the sea, their lands destroyed by hunger. We call them the Sea Peoples. But behind their migrations lay the same issue: climate and resource strain. Even in Europe, the costs were visible. Bog deposits of bronze weapons, many deliberately bent or broken, might reflect not only ritual, but desperation, societies trying to appease the gods as fields grew harder to sustain. The great hill forts of Central Europe, once bustling, show signs of abandonment. Populations shifted, searching for stability as landscapes changed under their feet. It's easy to romanticize the Bronze Age as an age of heroes and glitter, but the truth is sobering. The very processes that made civilization possible, smelting, farming, irrigation, logging, also pushed environments to their limits. And unlike today, ancient peoples had no plan B. When the soil soured, when the rains failed, when the forests were gone, collapse came swiftly. And yet, there's resilience in this story too. People adapted, moved, innovated. Some regions rebounded, others gave rise to new systems. The failures of the Bronze Age set the stage for the next chapter: iron, new technologies, new strategies for survival. But the warning remains. Every gleaming sword and shining vessel carried a hidden cost, one that the land and climate paid in silence. So, as we admire the treasures of the Bronze Age in museums, the swords, the cauldrons, the dazzling jewelry. We might also imagine the hills stripped of trees, the rivers running low, the skies stubbornly clear. Behind every shimmer of bronze was the shadow of its price. By 1200 BC, the Bronze Age world looked unshakable. Great powers ringed the Mediterranean Egypt under its pharaohs, the Hittite Empire, in Anatolia, Mycenaean Greece, behind its cyclopean walls, the bustling ports of Canaan, and trading cities stretching from Cyprus to Ugarit. Trade flowed palaces, glittered armies, marched in disciplined ranks. It must have seemed to those who lived in it like a golden age destined to last forever. And then, in the space of a few generations, it all fell apart. Archaeologists call it the Late Bronze Age collapse. Entire civilizations, burned cities, crumbled trade routes, vanished. The causes are many climate change, famine, internal rebellion, earthquakes. But in the stories of the survivors, one enemy looms larger than the rest: the mysterious Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples are a riddle wrapped in fire. Egyptian inscriptions describe them as marauders, coming from the sea in their ships, their lands destroyed, seeking new homes. Who they were is still debated, perhaps displaced groups from the Aegean Anatolia, or even further west. What we know is that they arrived in waves, fleets of ships, disgorging warriors armed with bronze swords, round shields, and horned helmets crashing against the coasts of the eastern Mediterranean like storms. Their arrival coincided with weakness. Droughts shrank harvests. Trade faltered. Kingdoms strained to supply their armies with tin and copper. Into this fragile world swept invaders hungry for land and resources. Ugarit, a thriving port city in Syria, left us a haunting letter from its king to a nearby ally. The enemy ships are approaching. Our cities are burning. Send help quickly. That help never came. Ugarit was destroyed, its tablets baked by fire into brittle survivors of catastrophe. The Hittite Empire fared no better. Hattusa, once bristling with bronze-armed chariots and stone walls, was burned and abandoned. Across Anatolia, cities fell silent, their archives buried under rubble. Mycenaean Greece collapsed too. Palaces at Mycenae Tyrans and Pylos went up in flames. Linear B writing disappeared. The warrior aristocracy was swept away, leaving only scattered villages to carry the torch of memory. Even mighty Egypt, so often the rock of stability, reeled. Ramses III, around 1177 BC, carved dramatic reliefs showing his battle against the Sea Peoples. Ships clash in chaotic melee, Egyptian archers raining bronze-tipped arrows, invaders tumbling into the Nile. Ramses boasted of victory, claiming he crushed them into the sea. And Egypt did survive, but only barely. Its empire shrank, its resources drained. The new kingdom's days of glory were numbered. Why did the collapse spread so widely so fast? Perhaps the Sea Peoples were both cause and symptom. Drought and famine may have pushed them from their homelands, setting off a domino effect of migration. Trade disruptions starved cities of tin, cutting off the very alloy that underpinned their armies. Without bronze, without food, kingdoms crumbled like dried mud. And once trade networks snapped, recovery was nearly impossible. For ordinary people, it must have been terrifying. Imagine watching smoke rise from your city's walls, hearing the clash of bronze swords and the screams of neighbors. Imagine fleeing into the countryside, clutching a child, leaving behind the house your family had lived in for generations. For centuries, civilizations had promised stability, abundance, order. Suddenly, all of it was gone. Yet even collapse leaves traces. In the ashes of destroyed palaces, archaeologists find hordes of bronze weapons, sometimes hastily buried and never retrieved. In the ruins of cities, broken figurines and vessels testify to interrupted rituals. On stone walls in Egypt, reliefs freeze in time, the desperate clash between pharaohs and invaders. These fragments whisper of a world that was both glorious and fragile, undone by the very complexity that once made it strong. By 1100 BC, the great powers of the Bronze Age were shadows. The Hittites vanished. Mycenaean Greece entered centuries of dark age. Egypt limped on, but never regained its empire. The glittering international order, the web of trade and diplomacy was gone. In its place rose smaller, fragmented societies struggling to survive in a world that had shrunk. The Bronze Age had ended, not with a whisper, but with fire and thunder from the sea, and yet, from its ashes, a new age was already dawning, an age that would wield a different metal, darker and stronger, pulled not from rivers of tin and copper, but from the stubborn heart of the earth itself. When the smoke cleared, after the collapse of the Bronze Age world, the survivors faced a new reality. The grand palaces were gone, the trade routes snapped, and the web of alliances had unraveled. Bronze, once the miracle alloy that bound empires together, was suddenly harder to come by. Tin, that elusive ingredient, no longer flowed easily along disrupted caravan paths and shipping lanes. What good was copper without tin? The furnaces cooled, the workshops fell silent. And so, in the wreckage, humanity turned to a new metal iron. At first glance, this was no obvious solution. Bronze was beautiful, workable, and already trusted. Iron, by contrast, was stubborn. Its ores were everywhere far more common than copper or tin, but they clung tight to impurities. To coax useful metal from iron ore required temperatures far hotter than bronze smelting. Bronze melts around 950 degrees Celsius. Iron needs nearly 1/200, and even then early smelters only produce spongy lumps of wrought iron riddled with slag. No gleaming pour of liquid metal, no elegant molds, just clumsy blooms that had to be hammered endlessly to drive out impurities. It's no wonder early iron tools were often inferior to bronze. They bent, they cracked, they rusted. For centuries, bronze remained the prestige material. Kings were buried with bronze swords, not iron ones. The armies of Egypt and Assyria carried bronze-tipped spears. The Mycenaean charioteers before their fall trusted bronze blades. Iron in its infancy was the poor cousin used only when bronze was scarce. And yet iron had one unbeatable advantage: it was everywhere. You didn't need distant tin mines in Cornwall or Afghanistan. You could dig iron ore almost anywhere: riverbanks, hillsides, even fields. Once smiths learned the trick of smelting and hammering it into shape iron tools, became accessible to societies that had never been plugged into the Bronze Age's expensive trade web. Where bronze was elite, iron was democratic. The Hittites may have been among the first to experiment with iron. By the late 2nd millennium, BC small iron objects appear in their records, daggers, ornaments, tools. Egyptian tombs, too, hold rare iron artifacts, including a dagger buried with Tutankhamun around 1325 BC. That dagger, astonishingly, was made of meteoric iron, literally forged from a fallen star. For the Egyptians, this metal from heaven was sacred, a gift from the gods. But the real shift came in the centuries after 1200 BC, as the Bronze Age collapse forced communities to adapt. With trade routes in ruins, tin was nearly impossible to obtain. Iron, once a curiosity, became necessity. Smiths learned to refine their techniques, hammering blooms into stronger, sharper blades. By 1000 BC, in regions like Anatolia, the Levant, and India, iron tools were spreading widely. The change was gradual, not instant. For a while, bronze and iron coexisted. Farmers might still prefer bronze sickles, but iron axes were handy for chopping trees. Warriors might carry bronze swords for prestige, but iron spearheads became more common. Over time, as techniques improved, especially carburization, the process of infusing iron with carbon to make steel iron began to outshine bronze in strength, durability, and availability. And with that, the balance of power shifted. Societies that mastered iron surged ahead. Assyria, rising in Mesopotamia, armed its armies with iron weapons and conquered vast territories. In India, iron plows opened new fields. In China, the Zhou dynasty moved from bronze ritual vessels to iron tools that reshaped agriculture. The Iron Age had begun not with a clean break, but with a slow, inevitable drift as practical necessity overcame tradition. It's tempting to see this as progress, a steady march from soft to strong, from rare to common. But it's also a story of survival. Iron didn't triumph because it was better. At first, it wasn't. It triumphed because the world of bronze collapsed and people needed something new. When trade fell, when forests thinned, when famine struck, iron was the metal that was still within reach. And so the Bronze Age gave way. Its gods, its heroes, its cities, its treasures all dimmed. In their place rose a harder world, armed not with the gleam of bronze, but with the darker, sterner edge of iron. A new age was dawning, one that would forge empires' fiercer weapons, sharper, and histories longer lasting. But the world would never quite forget the shimmer of bronze, the alloy that first taught humanity how to turn fire and earth into civilization itself. The Bronze Age ended long ago. Its empires fallen, its palaces in ruins, its trade routes scattered. Yet the alloy's story still shimmers in our memory, a reminder of how profoundly it reshaped the human journey. Bronze wasn't just a material, it was a milestone. It took us from the stone and bone tools of our ancestors into a world of cities, armies, and civilizations bound together by trade and ambition. Think back to the beginning. A chance accident in a furnace copper meeting tin gave us an alloy harder, sharper, more versatile than anything before. From that spark came plows that dug deeper, sickles that harvested faster, axes that felled forests, and chisels that built temples and pyramids. Bronze tipped the scales of agriculture, freeing hands for crafts, writing, and governance. It wasn't just a tool for farming, it was the foundation for cities. On battlefields, bronze glittered as the edge of power. From Mesopotamian spear lines to Egyptian chariots, from Mycenaean fortresses to Hittite armies, bronze weapons gave rise to warriors, to kings, to empires. The sight of gleaming helmets and swords was as much psychological as physical power reflected in sunlight dominance hammered into form. War, for better or worse, was reborn in bronze. In temples, bronze became sacred. Idols, vessels, and bells glowed in ritual firelight, carrying prayers to gods and ancestors. In China, it rose to a cosmic scale, cast into colossal vessels inscribed with messages to heaven, embodying kingship itself. The alloy wasn't only functional, it was spiritual, a bridge between humans and the eternal. And in trade, bronze built the first global networks. Tin from Cornwall, copper from Cyprus, lapis from Afghanistan, amber from the Baltic, all converged in the smith's furnace. Merchants braved seas and deserts to keep the alloy flowing. And in the process, ideas, languages, and cultures mingled. The Bronze Age was the first age of globalization, its arteries pulsing with caravans and ships laden with metal. Of course, the cost was high. Forests fell, for charcoal soils eroded under heavy plows, rivers shifted under irrigation, and climate shocks exposed the fragility of systems stretched too thin. The collapse around 1200 BC was as much environmental as political, a warning that complexity, while dazzling, is also delicate. And yet, even in collapse, the legacy endured. The tools of bronze laid the groundwork for iron. The cities and states it enabled gave rise to new empires. The myths it inspired of heroes, with gleaming swords of gods, with bronze thunderbolts, echoed into later cultures. Even today, When we describe the dawn of civilization, we divide it not by kings or dynasties, but by metals: stone, bronze, iron. Bronze sits at the center of that story, the hinge between prehistory and history. Its shimmer lingers in museums: the polished sword, the intricate figurine, the humble sickle. It lingers in our language, in metaphors of bronze strength and bronze beauty. And it lingers in our imagination, in the tales of Achilles' bronze-clad warriors, of Moses' bronze serpent, of the bronzes of Shang and Zhou. These echoes remind us that the Bronze Age was not just an age of metal, but of transformation, when humanity first learned to bend earth and fire into something greater than the sum of its parts. So as you drift toward sleep, picture the glow of a Bronze Age furnace. The bellows wheeze, the flames roar, and a stream of molten metal pours into a clay mold. When the mold breaks, something new emerges: an axe, a sword, a vessel, a symbol. Civilization itself reborn in bronze. The Stone Age was over. The Iron Age was coming. But the Bronze Age, that was the moment humanity first gleamed.